Hello class, this is our time cycle and it's your first context on the Hopewell Cultural Group / Tradition. So some essential questions is who were the Hopewell Cultural Group? What is the difference between a tradition / culture and a tribe? When did they live? Where did they live? And what did they do? And over here you have artist rendering of what one of their temporary settlements might look like. You have the kind of wattle and daub thatched houses, the canoes. You see sunflowers. That's not decorative. They are the group that took the sunflower from being a wildflower into a cultivar, which means it was grown for its seeds and oil. And our sunflower seeds today are incredibly larger than the original sunflower seeds were. So who the Hopewell Cultural Group was, they are Native Americans, and the cultural group occupied a large landmass. They had complex trade routes, a civilization, and the largest city in North America during pre-Columbian times. Pre-Columbian means before Columbus in 1492 and the following widespread European colonization of the Americas. They are called Hopewell after the farm where important artifacts were found. We don't know what they called themselves. They did not have a written language. And over here in the image you see an artist rendition of the people using the ceremonial mounds for different things. You have kind of a place where you have an audience and then the activities going on in the middle, and that is what they thought they were configured for. So what the difference is between a cultural tradition and a tribe. A tribe is a unit of people who are banded and united together. They have common beliefs, characteristics, family structures, and government, like modern Native American tribes do. They have a tribal leader, a tribal council, and then a whole range of other things with that. Now, a culture / tradition is a collection of tribes that share similar beliefs and practices. They have a lot in common, but they don't have a formal government structure. They don't have a formal hierarchy over all of them like a king or an emperor or president. They are just collectively alike. And on the right you see an artist renditioning again of what some Hopewell people might have looked like. We know that the jewelry is accurate. We are guessing at the hairstyles based upon how there are marks on skulls that when you repeatedly cut your hair or shave your hair in the same way, if you make mistakes and nick yourself, eventually that can change, the scar tissue, and you can kind of tell. So when they lived, the Hopewell culture dated from 200 BCE through 500 CE. So that's before Common Era, or BC, through 500 Common Era, which is AD. And this is considered prehistoric because they did not have written histories. A lot of people think that prehistoric instantly means cavemen and dinosaurs and uncivilized wildness. It doesn't. It just means that a culture did not have anything written down as far as we understand it. There are cultures today that are considered prehistoric because they don't write things down. But they did have oral histories that have been passed down into other tribes. They created art, and they left behind artifacts and earthworks. So if you look over here in the timeline, you can see I have two white arrows. There's a white arrow here for Hopewell, showing how they existed from right before 0 to afterwards. And over here, this white arrow, that is when Europeans started colonizing America, when Columbus stepped foot on it and brought everybody else with him. Even though there were previous Europeans that landed on America, Columbus is the one that started the colonization. When you look at other tribes, so you can kind of see at the same area, the Olmec tribes that are very old are before the Hopewell. The Mayan tribes are before the Hopewell, during the Hopewell, and lasting into Western civilization or Western colonization, excuse me. And up here at the very top, you see the Pueblos, which we are going to be talking about next in the next cycle, that kind of existed before and after the Hopewell. What happened with the Hopewell, there was another group that existed before them, and then the Hopewell, and then after the Hopewell happened was the Mississippian culture. And the big difference between Hopewell and Mississippian was the Mississippians settled down and started farming. And they had corn. And that changed a lot of the way of life. So where the Hopewell lived, these cultural groups ranged from Canada and Lake Ontario, way up here, all the way through the Midwestern states, and even a little bit over into the eastern states like New York and Pennsylvania, and down throughout the Midwest, down to the Gulf of Mexico. So that's a huge amount of land. The center of the culture at the time that we're talking about is in Ohio, which then wasn't Ohio. Ohio is this part. But those that are considered Ohio comprise this whole area here. That's Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Illinois. So the area that they lived at, what that was like during the time, the climate was temperate. It was woodland. It had grassy plains. This was the time period before corn. There's no corn. There was no modern plants, no cultivars. They created some of our first cultivars by taking wild plants and domesticating them and selectively breeding them. There were no horses. There were no cows. There was no widespread agriculture. And metal manufacturing was limited to copper and decorative metals like silver and gold, though they did not use gold. The wildlife in the area, though, there was a lot of it. There were huge herds of buffalo and elk and deer. The predators in the area were wolves and black bears, bobcats, and cougars. Those were the large predators. There were, of course, the small predators like foxes and wild dogs and whatnot. They did domesticate dogs. That was their only really domesticated animal. So how they lived, they were semi-nomadic, and that means they were hunter-gatherers. So most of the things that they ate and used, they got from wandering around and finding them. But they're only semi-nomadic because they kind of would live in a cycle and return to the same areas every year. And they also had centralized meeting areas. These centralized meeting areas were the mounds in the cities, and they would go there ever so often to have ceremonies and also to interact with other tribes for the purpose of marriages and trading and information and things of that nature. They built homes of wattle and daub, which is like mud and straw. That is the body of the building. So if you were in the far west, it would be considered adobe. But it's just a little bit different than adobe because it is built around wood. And then they had these thatched roofs. They traveled by foot or by water. And that's a reconstruction of one of their dwellings. So their civilization, trading was critical to their culture, trading and traveling. And over this huge area, they had common ways of living. There was limited evidence of conflict. They did not fight a lot. It wasn't like, this is my tree, don't come near it. It was like, okay, I've had my turn with this tree. I'm moving on now. You can have a turn with the tree. They had people that were important, but they did not seem to have a formal government or a central government. They did have hunters were very important in their society, and we can tell that by their burials and what they were buried with. Most other people were cremated, but there were some people that were viewed as spiritual, and they had elaborate burials in the mounds. So if you were just a regular person, you would have been cremated. If you were a hunter, you would have been buried with certain artifacts. And then if you were a special spiritual person, you would basically have a lot more stuff. And this is like a side view of one of the burial mounds. And you can see there's different layers of people. And we talk about this in the content section of this course. Okay. So civilization, the mounds in the cities, they used the mounds for different things. Some of them were used for burials. Some of them were ceremonial centers. Nobody was buried there. It was just a meeting place for certain specific things, and then also just as trade locations. Some of the mounds were very specifically aligned with stars and planets. They acted like giant calendars. They worked on actually a 32-year cycle of measurements of time. So these mounds would line up and you could plot the day, the month, the time, etc. based on a 32-year cycle. Chilote in Ohio is the location of Mound City. That is the main meeting site. It had 24 mounds in a walled area plus living areas. And then the later city of Cahokia in Illinois, which is at the end of the Hopewell and beginning of the Mississippian culture, that was the largest city in North America until Philadelphia surpassed it. It was actually one of the largest cities in the world. And this is a rendition of it. There was a step pyramid. Think about where else in the world you see step pyramids. And yes, it is thought from various artifacts that some of their trading and traveling might have extended down throughout Mexico and Central America. There were other mounds around it. You can see they're different heights. There's other pyramids. And then there were large areas of the houses and things like that. This doesn't look large to us by current day city standards, but for the time period, it was incredibly huge. And considering that it was a nomadic people that didn't stay there 24/7, but moved around, it's really kind of an amazing thing. So they traveled. They did not have, obviously, horses. So they followed rivers and they walked. And when they followed rivers and traveled by boat, they used canoes like the one pictured. They're birch bark canoes. So the inside is made up of bent wood laths, which are the kind of stripy things. And then that has different types of woods for the parts that you sit on. And then around it is birch bark, which is peeled off of trees. We don't have a lot of birches around here. We're too far south for that. It's similar to our sycamore trees and the ones you see that has a peeling bark on it, except for birch bark has like an extra covering that makes it strong and waterproof. And the canoes usually sat 4 people. There were longer canoes, but usually 1, 2, 4. So your assignment for today is you're going to watch a linked video. It's a general overview of the Hopewell Culture National Historical Park and Hopewell Culture, where the park people are going to talk to you about everything. Very quickly. It's 5 minutes long. I want you to answer these questions, and you have to listen to the video to find the answers. How did they end up being named Hopewell? What was the general purpose of the mounds that was mentioned in the video? What tool specifically did they use to throw spears? And why are the mounds lower today? The tool that they used, you do not have to spell it correctly. You could also describe it. It is considered to be one of the most important early inventions. Okay, that's it.